welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive. In this week's episode, we are going to be continuing in our series, United Together, looking at some of the text from 1 Corinthians. This week's passage or topic was United in Mission, and today I'm joined by interim lead pastor, Mid-Rivers campus pastor, fantasy baseball commissioner, Dan Borth.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for getting all of my current titles all lined up. This is this is an honor and joy to be with the Deep Dive today.
Yeah, you've had a couple weeks off from Deep Dive, and Chris has joined me the last few weeks.
I have.
We got a bonus episode that we are going to be doing on some of the content that we didn't fully get to last week.
Juan Soto?
Oh, man, I wish. Although maybe. Yeah, maybe that will be a topic for a deep dive. No, on singleness and marriage in the church, sexual ethics as they come up in 1 Corinthians. Yep. But that's not the topic of today's episode. This is our normal episode. We are following the conversation from this weekend. If you were at our Mid-Rivers campus, we talked about United in Mission. Yep. We looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul talking about sacrificing rights for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of winning others. And then we had a panel join me. So Jacob Shuttle, who's helping to lead the missions initiative here at our Mid-Rivers campus currently. Amy Gall, who heads up Operation Christmas Child, and just as an incredible conversation partner. Yep. The way that she's been involved in missions, even going back to college on a short-term standpoint, but then also, what she and her family do week in and week out. And then Christy McCaw, who I just got to meet this last week in preparation for that conversation, who just got back from a trip from Uganda earlier this year with Joe and Julie Cox and Enduring Treasure Ministries. And so just a great conversation. Any conversation where you have four people, it's probably not going to be as focused as you want, but the goal wasn't to come out with like 20 action steps. The goal was just to hear four people discussing something that they're passionate about and, what it looks like to step into this mission that God has us all. Yep. And so if you didn't get a chance to listen to or watch this past weekend's service or message, I highly invite you to do so on our app, on YouTube, wherever we have it in lots of different places. You can feel free to just scrub through my part and just get to the conversation, because that's where the money was, I think. And speaking about money, that is, dude, did you see that transition?
That was smooth. That was a good segue.
That was a pretty good. Although one might ask, is it a good segue if you have to point out that it was a good segue?
I feel like this is more of a celebration than a pointing out that it is a good segue.
It was good. So one of the points that I made this weekend, one of the ways that we are all called to participate in God's mission as followers of Jesus is through financial giving. There's a whole lot of context that we can use to talk about this, but before we kind of go through the 1 Corinthians text and then some other supplemental texts found throughout scriptures, Dan, as a pastor, as pastors, we've had to talk about money.
Yes.
This year in ways that I know I haven't had to talk about it or consider it. Yeah. I imagine you're in a similar boat.
Very much so.
What's that been like for you?
It's humbling. It's humbling to see the flow of generosity, of stewardship, to recognize, like, in talking about like a church budget or a ministry budget, or even when it comes down to like really intentional things like a compensation budget for people who are on staff because of the mission here locally, like all of those things, to feel really responsible for appreciating and seeing what each of those dollars is. That's somebody else saying, I'm in on the mission, or I'm for something moving forward. I'm personally, it's more than contributing is such a good word in the moment of talking about giving, but it's more than contribution. And I think, like, last thing I'll say here is, just as an adult, I'm becoming aware of how many millions of places you could invest. Anyone could rightfully say, here's the cause that I'm all about. And I think being in this seat now, I just appreciate how unique and special it is for somebody to say, I'm all in on the local church and her purpose. So, whether it's money coming in, that's a delight, or adjusting budgets, which we've had to do this year, because of circumstance and things like all of that. It's just really humbling. It's really humbling to see the buy-in of the people who believe in Jesus and gather for worship at Calvary and are stubbornly, in some ways, and graciously and generously committed to, to our moment, to our responsibility, our opportunity to represent Christ in our area, in our day.
Yeah, when we read texts like Acts chapter 2, 42 to 47. Yeah. The early church described as, they basically gave all to anyone who had need. Yeah. It sounds so simple. Yeah. And I know we live in a different culture, point in history today than the early church did then. I also know that was using language like gave all, like doesn't probably literally mean they gave everything and they didn't have, for themselves. But yeah, the complexities of helping to lead a nonprofit organization that relies on the generosity of its members, both for things like paying electric bills and paying staff salaries and sending money to mission partners overseas. It's a lot for sure, and so I feel a great responsibility for how we talk about money. Yeah. For even the ways in which we communicate, hey, this is where we're at financially. And some people, I was talking to someone the other day, and they're like, hey, it's not, as members, it's not our job to give only if we know how it's being handled on the other end. We're called to obedience and give as the Lord has called us to give. And that's our stewardship. And, your responsibility, you're speaking to me, is to steward that well. But my giving isn't contingent on how you steward it. But at a certain point, this is me interjecting now, but at a certain point it is, because if I'm not stewarding it well, then it's foolish for you to give. There's a lot of places you can give that I think, glorify God, and He, multiplies. Yeah. Anyway, there's a weight, there's a responsibility to it. Even how we talk about it in services, in that, generosity moment, it is an investment. You are participating in the mission, and we don't want to give just because you're seeing your dollars at work. Even though it's important to talk about the mission to inspire people to give in the way that God is leading them in that moment. We also have, I think, culturally speaking, for our church anyway, it's 2022, and Calvary was birthed in the 1960s, but in the 1990s and early 2000s, church growth movement, we were very intentionally seeker-focused. Seeker-focused often, means that you're attracting people who have no church background. So these customs and things that are ingrained in, people like you, people like me who've grown up in the church, that's a new pattern that we're asking people to develop. And so church isn't, not everybody's arrived all at once, not to even say that giving X is a mark of arrival. It's not a pay to play. It's anyone's welcome and anyone should be here. That's right. But it's something to keep in mind, that should inform how we talk about it, how we think about it. We're always wanting to see people take their next steps, and that includes in trusting God in areas of finance as well. Yeah.
Brad, I love that awareness. In the context of 1 Corinthians, I get the sense that that's a little more of Paul's audience, is talking not with people who knew the customs, especially from the Jewish heritage, where
it's a Gentile church.
Tithe was involved in that. But one of the neat things, interesting things about Paul's ministry is, his desire. I think it's Galatians. He says, his desire was to look after the needs of the poor, and that was what he was eager to do. And so, in our warm up before we turned the camera on, you were talking about how in Acts and in several of Paul's letters, we see him talking about collections for the saints. Was it a famine that went through Jerusalem?
Yep.
And so in these particular moments, Paul has this awareness of a need and a heartbeat for the Christians of Jewish heritage, because that was his people. He talks about that in Romans 9. And he encourages this solidarity in the gospel, a demonstration of the unity through generosity. In fact, some of his language, like sometimes when I've never heard anyone like heretically teach these passages in 1 Corinthians, but a lot of times they start getting real practical about giving today. But it's a really beautiful thing to understand what Paul was asking people then. He was literally asking them to show your love by opening your wallet, your purse strings, so to speak. But he didn't put a contingency on that. He didn't say if you give 100, you got a lot of love. He didn't say. There was nothing in that. He's actually very faithful to what Jesus taught. When Jesus said, "Look at the widow who threw in her 2 pennies. Like, she's given more than any one of the religious people who pomp and circumstance paraded their way to the box at the temple." Like, I think Paul beautifully captures the Christian ethic of generosity, which is with love, with what's the word he uses? A cheerful giver.
Yeah, cheerful. Yeah,
I love that word.
Corinthians.
Like, what a good test. Like, is my giving, is my participation financially cheerful?
Yeah.
That's a benchmark for God.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, he's so there's this collection that he is taking for the saints in Jerusalem. And it is interesting here. He's not giving instructions. He's not specifying a percentage or a dollar amount. This also is it's an alms giving, right? It's a giving for the needs.
Yeah.
So he's not even saying this should replace, what he's assuming they're probably giving or should be giving to their local church too. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, I'm going to read this. And then there's a few different passages we can consider as well. But he writes this: "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me." There's a few things that I just kind of want to point out here. I think Paul, he's wise to say, or what he doesn't say is, when I get there, we're going to take up a collection. He's
pass the hat.
Right. There's he's not going to emotionally manipulate in the moment.
Yeah.
He also knows that, like, if people don't plan or budget to give, then they're not going to give as much because that will have been spent somewhere else. So I think there's a nugget for us in that. Over the weekend, when we talked about giving, I shared, like, we should give first, we should give generously, we should give cheerfully, and all of that we should give faithfully. Like that is our role as a church.
Because ultimately, it's a stewardship.
Totally.
We've been entrusted with whatever our situation and circumstances in life, like, the Christian eyes are developed to see, like, God's given me an opportunity to steward this moment, to be responsible for everything in my field of view, great or small, like no difference there. And that's the context of any gift is the stewardship. It's God's given to me. He owns the cattle on the 1,000 hills. I might manage one of the hills, maybe a half a hill, maybe the ant hill on the east side of the
maybe
farthest.
I can claim ownership of one of the cattle, one of the cows. But like even then, it's still not mine.
That's right. And my responsibility is to raise that thing, to care for that thing, but also to use that cow to glorify God, and to use creativity and discretion and interest and personal investment. Like it's giving is not in the Christian world is not detached. It's not dishonest. It's not aggrandizing. One of the most haunting stories is who were the two that came before the apostles when people were like donating estates and they said, here's our estate money. And it wasn't Aquila and Priscilla were the really faithful people. I'm going to have to look this up, but they go in front of the apostles as the story goes. And Sapphira? Is that the ones?
Sounds right.
Man, guys, we're really this is not a strong like deep dive moment where
we're on the deep dive and we're trying to grasp at the
you got it Acts 5
the names that would appear on a Bible content exam in the end of seminary.
I'm so glad it's all written down at this point, right here.
Oh my gosh, right?
Ananias and Sapphira.
Yes.
Acts 5.
As Christians, we should never be too arrogant to say we don't know.
Oh man,
but the Bible tells us.
Right. Yeah. Just keep your Bibles open, right?
Keep them open.
That's the goal. But yeah, like they have this moment where they're kind of doing what the rest of the community is doing. But for whatever reason, I guess they sell their property, but they keep some of it. And when they go to the apostles, they say, here's all of it. And the apostles ask, like, is this all of it? And they say, yeah. And then they like drop dead right there. And it's kind of a haunting story. I've gotten the impression, that what was desired wasn't necessarily the full gift, but just honesty. Like there's no like giving in the Christian heart, in the Christian community, because there is a social aspect to it, is just not a thing about status, and it's not a thing that should ever be a point of pretense. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Like it's okay to say, I give, I don't give, but that's the point of the next step, right? Is to like, how can I grow in my cheerful generosity? It's not a merit badge.
Yeah. Let me follow up on that in 2 Corinthians 8.
Okay.
This is in chapter 9. Paul writes, so again, he's corresponding with the Corinthians. And he writes, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. And in this matter I give you judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack." So Paul, again, he takes everything back to the gospel, right? And there's something there of, even in Jesus, I think about like Philippians chapter 2, where, he empties himself for the sake of others. He demonstrates a humility that we're also called into as well, that even stepping into it, we may become weak in some worldly sense, and yet we've inherited great richness. And yet from that abundance, we're called to give back as well. And so anyway, I just think there's something there. Like Paul, when he describes giving, like he doesn't use language of like, oh, you're compelled to give. Everyone should give voluntarily. And and when it's voluntarily, it brings much blessing. Now, that's not a prosperity thing that like giving voluntary is going to result in me, making a lot of money in other places.
Right.
But it's what God does is he takes that and he multiplies it.
Well, I think I guess if you can, like a lot of it maybe is an invitation into a matter of perspective. And so like, it's true. Like it's not I give so that I'm blessed, but like, I do think, in our healthier moments as believers, what we get to see is my giving is a blessing. It's an active blessing that's going to someone else. And there is a kind of joy in that that maybe is important.
Yeah.
I also, something that I love, that even the way you read that helped something stand out in that, like in Paul's idea, he seems to understand like everyone's situation is different and everyone's situation like God is in. And so like the question isn't who gets the donor brick, the question is, what has God provided in this moment that you might provide, for the care of people or the mission of the work. That's really a kind of a profound idea. Is whatever moment I'm in, God asks nothing more than that I steward this moment really well.
Yeah, it's really good. All right, we have a few minutes left, and what I want to do is kind of turn our attention to the Old Testament. So we hear this tithe word. I have conversations in passing in the hallways on Sunday mornings, like even here, people, I think in their, great intentions of like sharing, hey, when we talk about giving, like people need to know it's a tenth, like it's a tenth, and then anything on top of that is giving. And so, and I don't think that's a bad principle. I do think that Jesus pushes against legalistic giving.
That's for sure.
And for some people, similar to maybe credit cards, right? Like we know ourselves, and maybe having a tenth or setting up a rule for yourself is a good way to do that voluntary, generous giving.
I don't mind sharing. I'm one of those people who like I don't know that I'm a poor manager of money, but I also don't know that I'm brilliant with it, And so like my limits, I get distracted.
Yeah.
I love Taco Bell. And so one of the ways that in our lives, a tithe has been helpful is it's helped us be cheerfully generous with some level of consistency. That my own personality would just not do well with.
Totally. No, same thing. And I think a lot of people are wired that way. For my wife and I, we've set up our tithe in the same way as we set up automatic bill pay. For our electric or for our water. Like we don't want to miss it because we know if we miss it, we've probably spent it, and then we're not giving, or then we're trying to pay back the next month. So it's an automatic. Online giving allows us to do that. It's auto bill. We set the amount and we set the frequency. And but the word tithe comes from that's not a word I use often, like tithe.
It really doesn't come up in conversation except for this specific focus.
Space. It comes from an old English root word meaning a tenth.
Okay.
So that's where we get the tithe and the tenth. In the Old Testament.
I wonder if I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
Practically today, if we shouldn't just talk about the tenth rather than the tithe.
Yeah, it's probably one of those words that like we use synonymously with giving, like tithes and offerings. Which is, this is a good like meta moment. Like if have no church experience and I'm sitting down and I just hear this word tithe used, I'm like, what's that?
I don't know.
Anyway, that's good. Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30. Every tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. This is coming out of this Old Testament law of people weren't giving to God what was God's. And so like so many things, there was a rule that was created to ensure that people would do the thing that they were called to do.
We see that at the start. Like Cain wanted to give a lesser offering to God, but still have it count as a full.
And then even in Genesis, like with Abraham, the first time actually the word tithe comes up is him tithing to Melchizedek.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So it's not even like tithing it to the Lord. He's tithing it to Melchizedek there.
Priest, king of Salem and priest of God.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, Dan, my question is this with the couple minutes we have left. Is tithing in the 10% regimented way, like, is that still like a New Testament biblical thing to do? Is it not biblical for us to ask people? That's the thing I wrestle with as somebody who asks and calls the congregation to give. What do we do with that?
Man, such a great question. I think the answer is, and I hope to not be dodgy here, but I also wrestle with it. And I know the choices that Mandy and I have talked through and made for ourselves. I think the tithe is biblical. It is in the pages of Scripture. It is in the description. It's practical and helpful. It certainly doesn't do any harm unless it becomes a legalistic rule, because the New Testament vision for giving, I don't think is percentage calculated. I think it's need meeting. I think it's heart generous. And so while it's very practical, and I've heard it taught in wonderful ways, and again, it's been helpful to me. I remember a time in my life where I kind of got off track with that. And when I got back on track, then I felt guilty for all the off track, and so I was like, I think it was my grandma I talked to, and I was like, Grandma, what do I do with this? And she reminded me, like, Jesus' love and his grace, like, is so much bigger than the checkbook ledger, I remember talking to a friend and saying, like, this is hard, right? Like this is like painful. And he said, well, but on the other hand, like, it's also valuable to participate. So, like, I've had a really healthy conversation around it in my life, but for the church, what I would say is each of us, I think what we're called to do is to consider the condition of our heart and the condition of our generosity. And I really liked your language of next steps. Like, for somebody who gives the occasional gift, the question is like, is that cheerful and generous? And the question for someone like me who's got maybe a more established, like, pattern, or the person who asked you that question, or, sorry, I hate saying like me, because I'm not the most generous person in the church.
Sure.
Like, I need to say that clearly. Like, I'm growing in this too. My next step is to make more space. You know what I mean? Like,
well, because even the person that gives 10% regularly, like, their next step might be they need to give 11, or they need to, create a space to give generously to people or family,
That's right. And I've heard of some, like, who in their overabundance at times, they start giving 90% of what comes in, and they live off 10. But the point isn't that one's more holy than the other. The point is, like, all of us are called to this Christ-like intentional giving. Like, the last thing I'll say, I know we're up against time.
Yeah, we got 30 seconds.
But consider that Jesus, who emptied himself, that was planned before the creation of the world.
Yeah.
I think that tells us about something about how we're supposed to give as well. Intentionally, generously, cheerfully.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, about 10 seconds. Thank you for joining this episode of the Deep Dive. We will be back next week with more. You can find this resource and more on our website, calvary.church/resources. Go in grace and peace.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.